Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today's talk is Presenting Your Research Like a Pro, sponsored by our good friends at Bentham Science. Professor Gareth Dyke is here with us, as always. Professor, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Scott. How are you? Everything okay?
Fantastically well. It's a beautiful, crisp winter day here in Tokyo. How's the weather where you are?
Great. A bit wet, but not too bad, not too bad. Welcome, everybody, to our event. I can see lots of people streaming in. Hopefully, you can put some information about yourself in the chat box. Let us know where you're from, where you're joining this event.
Fantastic. And while our guests are filing into the room, we'll just give a few moments here. We're going to introduce our good friends at Bentham Science, let you know a little bit about Bentham, what Bentham does, and the kinds of good research that Bentham publishes. So, Professor Dyke, can you tell us a little bit about our friends at Bentham?
Absolutely, absolutely. Welcome, everybody, once again to the event. Do put your name and let us know where you're from in the chat box. That would be great to learn a little bit more about everybody joining us in our event today. Of course, Bentham Science is a growth publisher of more than 100 traditional journals, as you can see on the slide in front of you, as well as 40 open access journals. So lots of outlets to choose from for your research. In addition, more than 1,300 ebooks, lots of information solutions for researchers in specialist STM areas, chemistry, biology, medicine, and engineering, to name but a few. Many of the Bentham journals have great impact factors. Do check us out. Do have a look at eurekaselect.com. And we're delighted to say, and Scott will confirm this in a moment, the most robust peer review process in the industry. And we're also listed, Bentham are listed in all of the major indexes. Peer review, very important, right, Scott? Bentham has a very important, robust peer review process.
Absolutely. If you were able to join us during our ethics event or our peer review events last year, you'll remember we talked about Bentham's robust peer review system then. And yeah, so absolutely a key factor of publishing in Bentham journals and textbooks.
We've got some colleagues from Italy. I can see Poland, Thailand, Uganda, wow, Ukraine, Berlin, Australia. Great. Fantastic to see people from all over the place, all over the world. I'm sitting in Budapest in Hungary. Scott, where are you?
I'm in the center of Tokyo here, and it's always exciting to see how many people come from all around the world to join these events. We really appreciate everyone's time. We know you're busy, you've got lots of things to do. It's a busy Thursday, and for most of you, it's probably early in your day, and you've got a full day planned. So thank you for making time to join this event today. We hope that it's worthwhile for you.
Absolutely, absolutely fantastic. If you are a librarian, and some of you might be, this slide is just for you. You can get free, absolutely free access to all of Bentham's content for 3 months with no obligation by scanning the QR code here on the slide. And even if you're not a librarian, you might want to scan the QR code anyway and then pass that information on to your university librarian. So that will give your institution free access to all of the Bentham content for 3 months. That's more than 40 impact factor journals, lots of opportunities to stay updated with all the great new research that Bentham Science is doing. And don't worry, we'll be showing this slide again a little bit later. So you'll have the opportunity to get access to all of our Bentham content. Scott, are we about ready to get going with our event today? What do you think?
I think we're ready to go. Our attendees are still filing in bit by bit, but I think we've got a great crowd already here. So I think we're ready to start. Yeah, let's jump in.
I see people from Iraq, from Nepal, from India, from Ethiopia, Poland, Ukraine. Absolutely fantastic. We'll give you our contact information at the end of the event. Of course, everybody who's registered for this will get access to the recording. If you're actually here in person, great to see you. You'll be getting a certificate of attendance, which is always absolutely fantastic as well. You can share that on LinkedIn, you can put that on your social media, and we'll be giving you the Bentham channels, the social media channels that you can follow at the end of our event today. So we're talking about how you can enhance your presentation skills in this event today, because of course it's something that you can learn. It's something that you can develop. It's a bit like riding a bike or playing the trumpet. I always like to say presenting skills can be developed. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, everybody gets nervous. Giving a presentation is an extremely scary experience, but we're here to help. And if you have questions, do put them in the chat box, do put them in the question box as we move through our event. We're going to be talking about 3 things today: preparing for a presentation, how you can get ready into the right mindset, get ready for that next presentation. Then we're going to talk about how you can speak, project, enunciate, one of my favorite words, effectively your language when giving a presentation. Doesn't matter in which language you give it, of course. And then thirdly, we'll talk some tips for better presentations. 12 top tips that Scott and I have put together to help you develop your presentation skills. Scott, do you remember the first time that you had to give a presentation? Were you super nervous? How did you overcome those nerves?
That's a great question, Professor, and we'll cover this today. But I do remember my first academic presentation and being incredibly concerned. I had to give a talk. I believe it was actually on Polish literature. I was doing a literature review, and I had to give a presentation talk. I think this was in my undergrad, and I was absolutely terrified. And how I got around it was by practicing, and by practicing to anyone who would listen, to my dog, to my family, to my fish. And that was a great way to get over the nerves of preparing for an academic talk. So we'll talk about that a bit later as well.
Awesome, awesome. So we've moved on to the first of our topics for our event today. So welcome everybody. And it's going to get going with a bit of a poll to find out how comfortable you are with communicating your research to the public. Right, Scott?
Yes, this is a question that we love to ask our audiences every time we talk about presenting, giving talks. And let's see what our audience feels today. Do you feel very confident, somewhat confident, not very confident, or absolutely terrified about communicating your research with the public? Let's see what our audience said.
Thank you for your
Great.
honesty, everybody. I know it's you know, you're amongst a group of strangers, but thank you for being honest and communicating this in the poll
Mhm.
as you feel, because it's going to help us. It's going to help you to develop those presentation skills.
Great. And the numbers are still coming in, but so far, okay, it looks like we've got most people answered the poll. So let's finish the poll there. And it looks like the results are 8% very confident. That's quite a small percentage. 56% somewhat confident, 25% not very confident, and 10% terrified. So that tells us a lot, doesn't it, Professor? More people were absolutely terrified than feel very confident in presenting their research to the public.
Yeah, we've got 30% of people there who are either terrified or not very confident. And that, I would say, that's probably a good breakdown of our audience generally. I mean, as you build up and develop your research career, as you move through your research career, you're going to end up doing more presenting, giving lectures, talking to students. But of course, many people joining us today will be early career researchers. Not that many opportunities to give presentations, but they're coming down the line. You're going to be going to conferences. You're going to be talking about your research in a number of different academic settings. How can you make sure that you do the best job possible? And here's a little survey that we used on social media in the run up to this event. I don't know if you saw it, but yeah, Scott's laughing. I can see that. Scott, do you want to talk about this for a moment? Like a survey,
Yes.
right?
Right, this is a fairly recent survey, and actually this finding has been replicated across a number of surveys. Quite often, public speaking ends up as number one on people's most feared things in life. And look at the other things on the list: snakes, spiders, thunder and lightning, enclosed spaces. So public speaking outstrips all of these scary things. It really is fascinating. Yeah, but it's a very common and universal fear. We all feel this way, especially in the early stages of giving talks.
But don't worry, as they say, it's a skill, not a talent. This is something that you can develop. This is something that you can learn to be better at. I did my PhD at the University of Bristol. I was petrified to give conference presentations, petrified to give talks. I talked to my supervisor at the time about it. His name's Mike. And Mike said, well, the only way to get over your fears at giving public presentations is to do more of them. So bless him, he gave me lots of opportunities at the time to go to conferences, do talks. I even did a few talks on his behalf at some conferences and events that he'd been invited to, gradually building up those presentation skills. And there's a number of situations here as an early career researcher where you might see the need to give a presentation. Sounds pretty obvious: academic conferences, department meetings, informal research talks, but they're quite different kinds of settings. And I don't know if you'll agree with this or not, but for me at least, by far the most stressful kind of presentation that I had to give was in my own university, talking about my research with people that I worked with and that I interacted with every day. So I don't know if you agree with that. Maybe you'll give us some thoughts in the chat box, but academic conferences, department meetings, and informal research presentations are the settings where we usually give talks about our research as academics. And of course, it's always very important to do the best job possible. And the reason for that, of course, is that people form those first impressions really quickly, which of course are then slow to change. So as an early career researcher, going to another university, giving a talk in your own department, or going to a conference, it's important to do the best job possible. And we'll give you some tips, some tricks, how you can do that, how you can present like a pro, important aspects of your career progression, because of course as well, you never ever know who's going to be in the audience. So making a good first impression, very, very important. And we'll talk about these also as well. Poster presentations, oral presentations, or short conference abstracts. Short conference presentations, the three main kinds of presentation formats that you will be engaging with at conferences and at presentations, moving around talking about your research. We're going to focus today on oral presentations, of course, but we've got lots of content. Get in touch with us if you'd like to learn more about these other formats, or indeed have a look at the Bentham YouTube channel or the Bentham website landing page, webinar landing page, where you can get access to all of our upcoming events and sign up for other things that we're doing in the future. Now, one of the key issues in preparing for a presentation is getting over that initial step of realizing that giving an oral conference presentation or an online presentation about your research is quite different to writing a paper. Most people think that when they go to a conference or give an online presentation about their research, they just have to go through their paper. And I'm sure you've seen lots of presentations that look like this. People just start off with the title, the abstract, the introduction. They talk about their methods. They go through the structure of their academic article. And that's the wrong approach to providing a short format conference presentation that's engaging and is going to entice and allure your audience, get them interested in learning about your research. Focus on the key takeaways from your research work, from your research in your presentation. And that's why on this slide, the bulk of your oral conference presentation, your online or face-to-face conference presentation, talking about your research is going to be focused on the results and, of course, on the illustrations, getting across the key message of what you've learned, what you've discovered, rather than just walking people through the structure of an academic article. So don't make that mistake. When you prepare for a conference presentation, focus on the results, the key messages, and those illustrations. And think about what your purpose is. You're going to be informing people. You're going to be persuading them that your argument, that your hypothesis, that your research is correct. And you're also going to be providing them with some entertainment to keep them interested, to keep them engaged in your presentation. Doesn't matter how short or long it is. What's your purpose with the presentation? Secondly, let's think about who's going to be in the audience. A great tip we always ask before giving presentations, Scott and I, who's going to be in the audience? Will it be an international group of people like today? Will it be local people? Will it be mostly non-natives, academics versus non-academics, right, Scott? What do you think? We always ask that question, right, before giving a talk or agreeing to.
Absolutely. Anytime we present something to an audience, whether it's a presentation or if we're writing for an audience, it's key to know who the audience is or are. And also, interesting point here that most of your audience will be English non-natives. So if you're a non-native English speaker or presenter, most of your audience will be too. So that's also important to keep in mind. Keep your speech and presentation very clear and simple so that it's easier for people to understand. Even if your English is wonderful, and I think many people here probably have wonderful English skills, try to keep your language as simple and clear as possible for non-natives.
So we're going for that slightly informal style that's not completely over the top informal, but that's not too formal as well. And we're thinking about not just who's going to be in the audience, but what kind of presentation are you going to be giving? Because, of course, an online presentation, quite different to giving a talk in a lecture theatre in front of hundreds of people, but no less stressful, I would say. Also, what kind of scale of the presentation are you going to be giving? Will it be a small group, maybe in a job interview or in a department seminar where there's just going to be 10 or 15 people in the audience? Or will you be talking to a huge auditorium full of thousands of people? So before you start to plan your presentation, think about your purpose, your audience, and what kind of style you're going to be giving the presentation in. And also think very carefully about how you structure your presentation, because talking about a research project that you may have published as an article is not going to be the same thing as a research presentation. So when to present? When should you get up on stage and start talking about your research? Should you do this before you publish? You may be able to do that if you're thinking about publishing that's been submitted to a journal. You would need to get their permission, of course, in order to do that. Most people will be presenting their research work after publication. Generally speaking, you want to do that so that you can't be gazumped. People can't see your presentation and go off and do it themselves. You may wish to think about doing pre-printing with your research if you're in that particular situation. That's something that we can talk about in the Q&A at the end. But check your conference guidelines. When are you going to be presenting your research to the wider world? And of course, as well, lots of fake conferences out there. You do want to check very carefully that the conference you've received an email about, that you've been invited to go and present at, is really a conference that's well respected and is going to help you to advance your career in your field. And there's great websites and other resources that we'll share with you at the end in order to check if the conference that you've been invited to attend is really a reputable one. Think about where key academics, key researchers in your subject area are going and spending their time and research money. And as Scott mentioned at the beginning, if you're nervous about giving a conference talk, and we'll come back to this a little bit later in our tips for presenting, practice builds confidence, learning those talking points, but not memorizing a script, although outlines, of course, are very okay. Keeping your audience in mind, trying to sound as natural and engaging as possible. Practice alone with colleagues. Practice with non-experts, with your parents, with your brothers and sisters, with your dogs and cats. Record yourself. Make sure that you have a presentation that fits into the schedule for the conference. And if you can, visit the venue. This is a great tip. Of course, if you're going to a conference, you may not get to see the venue of your talk until maybe the day of the talk, but it's always a really, really good idea to go in, see what the room looks like, see where you're going to be standing and how you're going to be presenting. So you can project yourself to maximum effect. And also those Q&As, right, Scott? Prepare questions in advance that you may get asked.
Absolutely. Anticipate those questions that people might ask you, and then you'll have answers prepared. And sometimes those questions will lead you to other questions. So the purpose just to get yourself to feel more and better prepared for your talk, because you may get those, sometimes questions that you would never expect or predict. But you'll find that most of the questions you get, if you really think about them beforehand, you can have answers at the ready.
All right, well, we're going to ask you a few questions now. That's enough talking from us. We're going to ask you with our second poll, we're going to ask you, what kinds of presentations have you given in the past? So do take a moment, make sure you're still awake to fill in the second poll. How are we doing, Scott? Everything okay?
Yeah, things are looking great. I wanted to ask our audiences what kinds of talks they've given. Now, of course, there are many, many, many kinds of talks. These are just some of them. But I'm curious to see how many of our guests have given poster presentations in the past, who have given slide talks, lightning, pichakucha, elevator pitches, a very specific type of short talk, if you've given or participated in departmental seminars. And there's also things like debates and mock debates. If anyone has joined those as part of your research presentations, let us know in the poll.
This also helps us to plan content for future presentations. As we mentioned before, we work a little bit for Bentham. We also have SciTrain, our own organization. If you'd like to get in touch with us, if you're enjoying this presentation so far today and you'd like to learn more about skills for researchers, writing and publishing, we have lots of different presentations. We'll put the link to all of our stuff into the chat box a little bit later. But if you're thinking, wow, I'd really like a presentation like this for my university or for my research group, you can get in touch with us at any time. How do those results look? And I'd never heard Pecha Kucha before, Scott. What is that? That's a lightning talk, right?
It's a form of lightning talk. Yeah, we'll talk about that a bit later, but it is a specific type that you might encounter. It's not, it's actually becoming more and more popular at conferences as a form of short talk. So we'll mention that a bit later. And looking at the poll results now, we've got 52% have given poster presentations and 92% have given slide talks. Fantastic. Great. And for short talks like lightning, pichakucha, it's less than 5%. Sure, it's kind of still a niche talk. So I'm not surprised by that. Departmental seminars, 52%. Sure. And actually, as you mentioned, Professor, others have commented as well in the chat box that that is something that they also find quite nerve-wracking and nervous, is giving those departmental talks. And at 6%, we have some of our audience have participated in debates or mock debates. That's great. Fantastic.
Yes, thanks again for sharing with us, everybody. That's really interesting stuff. It's really great to see. Let me just close that down. All right, now we're going to talk about the second part of our presentation today. Over to you, Scott.
Fantastic. Thank you, Professor Dyke. And whenever you're ready, you can go on to the next slide. So we're going to talk about speaking effectively, whether it's a slide talk or poster presentation. These tips will help you with any of the types of presentations that we've looked at today, whether it's poster talks, slide talks, lightning, and so on. So first is the verbal style that you'll use. And I think the most important one is on the top left there, to speak loudly and clearly. Don't be afraid to project your voice. There's lots of ambient noise happening at conferences and in rooms. So make sure that you're speaking loudly and clearly so everyone can hear you. Try to vary your tone and pitch. Use the music of your voice to show the endings of a section. and use pauses to give audiences time to sort of think and breathe and digest your points. Try to sound enthusiastic. This is your research, this is your discovery, it's your scientific adventure. So sell that feeling to people. Show your enthusiasm your enthusiasm in your research. Try to avoid talking directly to your screen or to your notes. I've seen lots of talks where people are just reading from a script. And I know it's difficult, especially if English is not our native language. It is tempting to want to read from a script. Instead, I would use maybe just short points or outlines and look down at your page from time to time, and that's fine. Just don't glue your face into your notes or your screen or turning at your poster all the time. Try to make eye contact with people as they listen. Okay. And filler words are okay sometimes. It's perfectly natural to use them. Native speakers use them all the time. Just try not to overuse filler words like sometimes is okay, but not too much. Next slide, Professor, if we could. So now the nonverbal. So again, facing your audience is important, making eye contact with people and using gestures as I'm doing now. If you can see it, it's a bit of a small screen. But I realize in some cultures, hand gestures are not typically used as much, but it is important to use gestures to make some points and to even just simply point to a finding on your poster or point to something on a slide if you're using a laser pointer. And keep your posture open. So instead of closed body language where you're hunched over and that makes people unconsciously feel nervous when we do this, try to use sort of circular body shapes. So open your body up a little bit. Keep your arms just slightly open if you can see. Maybe you can't see just now, but shoulders down and arms in sort of an open gesture. The more circles you have with your body language, the more relaxed people will feel. For example, pointing. If you're pointing with a sharp finger, it just sort of makes people feel a bit uncomfortable and nervous. But if you're pointing with sort of a nice round open hand, that unconsciously makes people feel more relaxed as they listen to your presentation, right? And try to relax or look relaxed. I know you may not feel relaxed, but you can actually emulate this feeling. And as you try to get your body into a relaxed position, your body will actually respond by making you feel more relaxed. So the more relaxed you look, the more relaxed you will actually feel. Next slide, Professor Dyke. Great. And some of the hand gestures, again, most of these are fairly universal. If you're coming from a culture where hand gestures are a bit different, these are the ones that you would typically use in these kinds of situations. So thumbs up is kind of universal positive. It's okay to count and rhyme off points. For example, the first finding that surprised us was X, right? And the second thing that we found was X. So it's perfectly acceptable to use counting on your fingers to rhyme off results and so on. Again, use open hands to point to people. If you want to point to something very specifically, you can use a finger, but try to avoid pointing at people. For example, that's a great question, Professor Dyke, is a little bit too much. Use an open hand. Again, round gestures will help people feel relaxed. Right? And there are many more gestures here, but on to using semi-formal language. You're going to use language that's a bit less formal than you would use, of course, in your manuscript. So look at some of these examples here. I won't read them all. Feel free to review the video later. But basically, we want to just use language that people can easily understand. It is a little bit different from the language you would use in writing. So instead of using things like substantial research, we would say a lot of research. So keep your language semi-formal, clear, and simple. Here's a trick, the say it 3 times trick. So you say what you're going to say. Today, we're going to talk about effective presentations. Number 2, say it. The best way to give effective presentations is blah. And then 3, say what you said. Today, we talked about effective presentations, and the 3 most important tips were blah, blah, blah. So this is the say it 3 times rule. And some people use even 4, 5, 6, or 10 times, but 3 is a good rule of thumb. If you say something 3 times, then your audience is more likely to remember the key points and key takeaways from your talk. Being engaging is something that Professor Dyke mentioned earlier. This is incredibly important, is to not just stand up there and talk at people. This is a communication exchange. When you're attending conferences, you're sharing ideas, you're sharing your research with people, and you're getting feedback from them. So Best thing you can do is make sure that people can engage with you. Check your microphones and your PC so that people can hear and see you correctly. If possible, meet people before your talk and just get a sense of who they are and their level. Right? And obviously, check that they can see and hear you while you're talking. And one of my favorite tips is to make sure that you have various ways to give people your contact details. That could be an email address that you put on your poster, on your slides. It could be business cards that you hand out if you have those. One of my favorite tricks is to get an A3 sized printout of your poster and fold it in half so that it's the same size as an A4. You can hand that out to people. You can slip it in an envelope, and you can sort of give a mini, version of your poster wherever you are at the conference. QR codes are also very popular. That can be a link to your research, to your ResearchGate page or whatever. So always find ways to keep networking with people, promoting yourself and your research work before, during, after your talk, in the lunch hall, in plenary sessions, and in anything, anywhere you are, you should have versions of your research there and your contact information to hand out to people. So always be networking. Thanks very much, Professor, for handing me the presentation for a bit there. And back to you. You're going to share some of your time-tested tips for better presentations, aren't you?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, I can't really be bothered, but yeah, I guess I will say a few more things now.
Now
Right.
you sound exactly like some of the people that we see at conferences, right?
Yeah, I
So
know, like annoying. Isn't it annoying when people do things with their hands, like when they're giving presentations or when they speak to kind of like, yeah, with those what do you filler what were you they were like filler words, right? Excellent, we're back.
fantastic.
Present.
So I think our our audience can see that Professor Dyke gave about 4 or 5 examples of things not to do during talks, and they were perfectly done. Well done, sir.
We're going to just give you our 12 tips for better presentations. Okay, so Scott's going to jump in throughout these 12 tips, but these are repeats of a few of the things that we've talked about already, some things that will be new, but if you follow these 12 tips, I promise you that you will be doing better presentations, both online and face-to-face, in person, than you currently are at the moment. And as we go through these, it will be very interesting to get your feedback in the chat box, in the Q&A. Do you agree? How many of these do you currently already do in your presenting, in your lectures, and in your conference presentations, for example? So, tip number 1, first thing to think about, as we've already discussed in this webinar today, identify your message before you plan your talk. Before you start to put your presentation together, what is the one thing that you want your audience to walk away from that presentation remembering? And I was given this advice as well when I was a young researcher. If you go to a conference or give a talk, you need to make sure that the one thing that you want people to remember about you, about your presentation, is reinforced throughout your talk. Scott mentioned the 1, 2, 3 method. You see news readers, preachers, religious leaders doing this all the time as well. They reinforce constantly throughout their presentations what the message of that presentation is. So if you forget everything else, at least you will remember that one thing. What's your take home message? You're going to repeatedly emphasize that, keeping it simple, effective slides, one single message as you go through your talk and you go through your presentation. That's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is understanding your audience. Who's going to be there? We talked about this already at the beginning of our event today. Will it be other academics? Will it be students? Or will it be members of the public? Or will it be a mixture of all three? Because who's in your audience determines your style and content, what kind of presentation you're going to create, and how much specific content. Don't fall into that cognitive bias trap that many academics fall into, where they assume that everybody else listening to them or reading their paper understands as much about the subject area as they do. So, tip number 2 is understanding your audience. Who's going to be there? How are you going to pitch the level and the content of your presentation to that particular audience? So tip number 1, your message. Tip number 2, who's in the audience. Tip number 3, and I'm sure you've all seen this in action at conferences before, how long is your talk slot going to be, and how are you going to fill that talk slot effectively? You do not want to be unplugged by the session chair. You do not want to have just started talking about your results section when it comes to the end of your presentation. I mean, you've seen this millions of times, I'm sure, Scott, at conferences. People haven't planned their talk to fill the time properly, right?
Amazingly, and also, even if we do plan very well, there are all kinds of unexpected things that can happen. For example, what I like to do is come up with at least two versions of a talk. So if the person who's speaking before you speaks too short, then you suddenly have time to fill. So then you need to have something that you can add to your presentation to try to maybe expand that gap. But even worse is when they talk too long and then you have less time to give your talk. So it's great to have a kind of a bullet points version of your presentation. So just in case your time gets shortened, you can still get through the main points of your talk anyway. So good idea to prepare a second, shorter version of your talk.
Yeah, so you don't want to have to rush, skip through your slides to get to the conclusion.
Right.
You don't want the session chair like looming over you. And I've even
Right.
seen people being unplugged from the conference projection system in a session where, you know, there's lots of other speakers coming. The last thing that the conference needs is somebody else talking well over time. There are other people going to be moving between different parts of the conference. People will have a program schedule they'll want to get to talks. So one message per slide is a great rule of thumb. 1 minute per slide is also a great rule of thumb. So if you've got a 15-minute conference presentation to prepare, you don't need 200 slides. Rule number 4, tip number 4, avoid death by PowerPoint. And we've all seen this loads of times as well. We refer you to a great resource. You can see it here on the slides. More is less in presentations. You can see here 2 slides from David's presentations that get the same message across, but I think that your documentation approach is not what you want in your presentations. Getting across those issues, much better done with pictures, much better done with less information, avoiding what they call death by PowerPoint. And again, Scott, I'm sure you've seen this like loads of times in conferences. Too much information, right?
Yes, we've all been victim to it, and to be honest, if I'm being honest, I have done it in the past as well. We've all killed others with our PowerPoints and been killed by PowerPoints. But I think this is a great point to remember the difference between documentation and presentation. Your poster is not your paper. Your slide presentation is not your paper. And that's why I think that giving things like short lightning talks is great practice because it forces you to realize what are the key things to take away, what are the key visuals, the key takeaways. So get into the idea of thinking of your talk as a very distilled, filtered version of your full paper. If you want people to read the full paper, give them a link to the full paper, but that's not your poster and that's not your talk.
We have another example here, like the company history presented in 3 different ways. And I think we can all agree that just writing out the company history and putting it on a slide, not the most engaging way to present that information. There's a good example here in the middle, and perhaps the most engaging, slightly different, done on the far right-hand side. So these are, again, examples of how you can present information that could be boring if presented in one particular way in a more engaging way. And we strongly recommend, as we talked about earlier in the slides that we showed about structuring presentations, you are not going to be talking all that much about your method in a research presentation, unless, of course, it's a new method a novel method, something that you want to share with the audience. But most of us are going to be focusing on our results. What's new about the study? What question are we addressing? What new novel steps forward are we providing? And very often we're using standard methodologies. So keep your method short and simple, maybe just one slide in a 15-minute conference presentation. We've all seen again those endless conference presentations where people talk a lot about their methods, and that's not really what the audience wants to learn about. They are here to learn and understand about your results. So focus your research presentations, if you remember that shape slide that we showed you a little bit earlier on the results. You're going to focus on the results. A good technique for doing this in short format presentations is to list 3 things that you found in your research, and then make a series of slides around those 3 key results, because people often can't remember more than 3 things. It's going back to that slide that Scott showed a little bit earlier, where you talk about something, you reinforce it, and then you reinforce it again. It's an old rhetorical trick that's been around for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. You present things in groups of 3. People remember groups of 3. Put your research results also into a group of 3. And tip number 5, of course, your illustrations are absolutely key. A picture is always worth 1,000 words. So in this example, it's not such a great illustration, but it definitely gets the message across. Your message is more important than beauty, but your pictures are where your presentation must focus, as you've seen in the examples that we've shared already. Tip number
There we go.
6, great tip when you get started. How are you going to say those opening few lines? And this was a great piece of advice that I was given as a student. When you get ready to give a conference talk, you deliver it with your opening lines in mind. A clear and steady pace, craft a strong opening, engage with your audience, and this will help you to conquer your presentation anxiety. Having those opening words ready to go when you get up there on the podium, when you start your presentation, is the best way to get over your nerves. And as Scott mentioned already several times, practicing makes perfect. Practice in front of a mirror, colleagues, friends, and parents. Do dry run talks in front of an audience. Get feedback, especially important if it's a conference presentation, or even more important if you're doing a presentation for a job interview. Time your slides and transitions. Preempt your content for audience engagement, and try not to speak off a script if you can, right? Scott, we've seen many people talking off scripts, and that doesn't look very good, really, does it?
Right. And when we say don't speak from a script, we don't mean don't draft a script or draft points or an outline or talking points. It's perfectly okay to look down at a series of bullet points. I like to make like a one pager with really big text. And this is especially true if you're presenting in a language that's not your own. So sometimes if I have to present in Japanese, for example, it's good to have a little helper sheet with bullet points on there that I can talk from. But what I will not do is just read directly, bury my face in my script and read from there, because then you're not engaging with people. So even if you're speaking in a language that's not your own, your native language, try to avoid reading from a script. Talking points, totally okay. Look down sometimes, look back up, but keep that eye contact going with your audience.
Because being nervous is completely normal. So tips for overcoming nerves are important, because if you weren't nervous before you had to give a presentation, you'd be abnormal. You are the expert on your research is another great piece of advice I was given as a young researcher. You're the expert. Nobody else in the audience knows as much about the topic, about the subject area as you do. Give yourself a bit of confidence. Practice your opening lines for the beginning of the presentation. Practice means that you know what to expect from the presentation, and try to practice and check your slides a little bit beforehand in that presentation room. If you can see your slides up on the screen in the room that you're going to be giving the presentation in, that's a great idea before you give the presentation. Tip number 9, don't be distracting. You are the center of attention when presenting, not your slides, which is a big mistake that many people make when giving in-person presentations. They have these flashy slides, they turn around in the conference hall and they start talking to the slides. You should be the center of attention, but don't distract your audience. Don't play with your keys or something else. Don't be with the habits that are distracting, and work on your speech habits. You can definitely train yourself to avoid those annoying kinds of speech patterns in your presentation. So tip number 9, don't be distracting when giving your talks, which brings us on to tip number 10, which is, of course, you are the center of attention. It's you, the researcher, the presenter, not the slides, that should be the focus of attention in the presentation. There's a reason that we call them visual aids, right? They're there to help you, the presenter, give the talk. They should not be the focus of the presentation. So don't hide away when presenting. Your audience wants to be engaged. You are the presentation. Take center stage. Your slides are visual aids, nothing more. And if you need help with designing slides, or you need help with putting slides together, do get in touch with us. We are delighted to help with that as well. So with you as the focus of attention, keep in mind that using a laser pointer forces you to turn your back on the audience. So takes focus away from you as the presenter. You don't want to lose engagement. You don't want to lose eye contact with your audience, and use body language, as Scott was talking about earlier, to engage and enhance your slides. And this will help you to deliver a more live, engaging experience. Don't forget that first impressions are absolutely critical. Engaging with your audience, keeping eye contact. I know impossible to do in webinars, but still we try our best. Responding to your audience, changing your tempo, changing the topic if you see people in your audience losing focus. And don't be afraid to engage with people while presenting. Ask questions. Know when to take a break. Know when to reinforce information that you have already presented, especially if you see people losing focus. Tip number 12, managing the question and answer session. You're going to have timed your presentation so that there's time for questions. Although not too many, you're going to be able to repeat the questions, give them back to the audience. This also gives you time to think about your answers to individual questions. You can be prepared. You can think about what questions are going to likely come up as a result of the presentation. And I use this technique all the time. Scott's seen me do this a lot. Dodging difficult questions is a real technique. Great question, Scott. I feel that deserves a thorough response. So let's have a talk after the session. Or you can just say, I don't know, which not enough people do, really. Don't ever be afraid to admit that you don't know the answer to a question as you manage that Q&A session at the end of your presentation. So that was our 12 tips for effective presenting skills. They'll all be in the video recording of this event. And if you are a librarian, we'd like to once again thank you so much. QR code here on the screen if you'd like to get access for your library to all of the Bentham Science content for the next 3 months, absolutely free. Martin has started off the Q&A session. I think we should jump in with a few questions that we've got lots of engagement in our event today. So thank you all so much for that. How are we doing, Scott? Everything okay? Everything good?
Absolutely. We have some great questions today, and we've got some questions in the Q&A box. But first, I wanted to highlight a great comment here. This is from Martin, and Martin says that there should be few I don't knows. So that's a great point. If we don't know the answer, then we should just be honest and say that we don't know. But at the same time, if we do too many I don't knows, it starts to sound like a bit too much. And we want to look like experts when we're giving our talks. So like many things, it's finding that sweet spot. If we use something too much, then the audience gets tired of it. So A few, I don't know the answer to that is okay, but there are other ways to defer difficult questions like, oh, that's a great question. I don't have an answer for you right now, but can I get back to you after the talk? Is a great way to defer that kind of a question. Or another way is to defer the question back to the audience. Well, that's an excellent question. I hadn't thought of that. I'm afraid I don't have an answer for you. Does anyone in the audience have an answer to this question? You might get someone to save you from the audience from a difficult question. So there are all kinds of tips and techniques that you can use to deflect questions that are difficult without just saying, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. That's a great question, Martin. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, deflecting questions is a great technique. Yeah, I love doing that. And if you can turn the question and answer session into more of an audience discussion, that's always a great technique because that makes you look very friendly, very engaging, and of course it takes away time from the Q&A. So you want to finish your talk with enough time for questions, but not too much time for questions, if that makes sense. You don't want to end up being heavily, deeply interrogated by lots of people in the audience at the end of that conference Q&A. So,
Indeed, indeed. A couple of great questions here, Professor Dyke, if you still have a moment. This is a question from one of our guests, and our guest says, I've conducted a presentation, and during a specific segment, I encountered a momentary lapse where I did not or could not speak or address the topic. This is a great question. This is something that happens a lot to people, those moments of kind of silent panic where you just sort of, don't say anything at all. And it's happened to a surprising number of people. It's happened to me. It's happened to people that I know. Professor, any advice on when that happens, if you're in the middle of a talk or a Q&A and you just get gripped by silence and you find yourself unable to speak? Have you found any techniques that help pull you out of that?
that's a really interesting question. Thank you for asking that. We do not, I mean, other than staying calm, and I know it's very difficult to say and very difficult to do, but it's yeah, I mean, it's happened to me as well, where you kind of just lose concentration for whatever reason in front of a group of people, but you'll come back, and everybody in the audience understands that giving a talk is a nerve-wracking, stressful experience. Everybody's in the same boat, especially at conferences. If you're a student, people will understand that, you may not have done this too many times in the past. So stay calm. And when you do get grip back on the presentation, try to keep going and maybe recap what you said before the break and bring the audience back along with you. I guess it's a bit like getting disconnected from your internet during the course of a presentation as well. Stay calm. It'll come back.
That's such a great point, Dr. Dyke. Everyone's been there. We've all been in that situation where we feel stressed, and you'd be surprised how supportive people are. I would find that, from my experience, people are more supportive of you if something goes wrong or you're having trouble. People are just more supportive and empathetic than if you're someone who thinks you have all the answers and you're arrogant and you know everything and you're better than everyone. We don't like this kind of person, do we? But someone who is trying their best and doing their best to communicate ideas and to get through difficult situations, we naturally empathize with people like that. So if something goes wrong in your presentation, it's probably going to work in your favor. People will sort of silently support you or
Absolutely.
vocally support you if you're struggling and having trouble. So yeah, don't be ashamed,
Absolutely.
don't feel nervous. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would add to that by saying, you can help yourself from things going wrong by checking your presentation before you give it in the room that you're going to be giving it in, on the computer or on the conference presentation software that you're going to be using for the presentation, and by keeping your slides simple. Like, we never use animations, we never embed videos, we never do things in PowerPoint that are going to possibly not work. In fact, we often present, like today, using PDF versions of the presentation. We keep it simple to minimize the possibility of things going wrong, right? And you can do the same with your presentations as well, because we've all been there. We've all sat embarrassingly in an audience while somebody's trying to get their video to work. The video is such a key component of the presentation that when it doesn't work, they've nothing to say, those kinds of embarrassing situations. You're just thinking, why didn't they check this beforehand?
Indeed. And we're coming to the end of our time here, but we have one more question if we have a moment, Dr. Dyke. This is a question from Abdullahi, and the question is, can a person present their abstract in a conference if it's already been published? Okay, this goes back to our ethics presentation from last year, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, it depends on the conference guidelines. Usually, yes. Usually, of course, and we've all seen presentations where people are talking about already published research, but it's important to cite that already published research. So if you're going to give a talk about something that's already been published, for example, you need to put that citation on your slides, right? You need to make sure that the audience is clear that what you're talking about has already been published or submitted, or maybe several pieces of work are there in that presentation that you're going to give. Cite yourself, cite your work, and nothing can go wrong. I think it's absolutely fine.
Fantastic. And with that, if we could not get to your questions today, feel free to reach out to us. We've shared our contact information, and we've also shared the link to Bentham Science website, as well as our SciTrain website. And Professor Dyke is kind enough to share his email in the chat as well. And we will be sending out certificates and a link to the full recording of the video in about 24 hours. So thanks to everyone who was asking for that. And we hope that this talk will be useful for you as something you can refer to before your next uh, slide talk, pitch presentation, anything, any elevator pitch that you're giving. Hopefully this talk will be useful for you.